Welcome to the Monday edition of the Post-Gazette Penguins podcast. I'm your host, King Jemison. And if my voice sounds a little bit raspy, I'm sorry. I might have gotten a little carried away screaming with joy after Jack Hughes delivered the golden goal for the U.S. in yesterday's Olympic final. We're going to talk about that and the Olympics as a whole. Of course, the biggest story from a Penguins perspective was Sidney Crosby's injury, and we'll give you some updates on that. But first, want to remind you that this show is presented by FanDuel, where you can bet on all the NHL action. Games return on Wednesday, and Penguins currently have the seventh best playoff odds at FanDuel at minus 260. One little note that would tell you that it does not appear Vegas is too worried about Crosby's injury for the odds to be that low or that good for the Penguins to make the playoffs. The Stanley Cup favorites at the Olympic breaks, according to FanDuel, are the Colorado Avalanche. They're plus 220. And then FanDuel has the Lightning at plus 500. The Carolina Hurricanes is plus 750. And the Penguins' opponents on Sunday, the Vegas Golden Knights at plus 950 to round out the top four lowest odds for the Stanley Cup with right around 25 games to go for most teams. So let's start by talking about the biggest story in Penguins land over the last week, and that was, of course, Sidney Crosby's injury. Didn't have a podcast last week, but if you were following along at Post-Gazette.com, you saw all our coverage of first his injury in Wednesday's quarterfinal over Czechia. Took a series of hard hits in the second period, including one from Radko Gudas that caused his right leg to sort of awkwardly bend. Takes another check along the boards just seconds later, and he skates off gingerly, does not return. Now, that looked really, really concerning. Definitely looked like it could have been a fairly serious injury. However, he did skate on Friday before their game against Finland, their semifinal game against Finland, reportedly at least, and he ultimately determined that he wouldn't play, but that was an encouraging sign. And then Saturday, he participated in practice. That was closed to reporters, so we can't really say how well he was skating, but he did participate, did skate there. And then it sounds like it was his decision to sit out the gold medal game against the U.S. on Sunday. He said that he was pretty close to playing, but he just didn't feel like he could truly help the team. And so it seems like an unselfish decision. And, you know, that also tells you that he's certainly hurt if he felt like he could not go out there and be at his best in a game that you know how much it means to him. But, you know, we talked to Brian Russ, Kris Letang about this at practice on Sunday shortly after the gold medal match. And both of them said that, yes, they were encouraged by the reports of him skating. Letang told me that he'd been asking lots of questions, or that they had been asking lots of questions around the medical staff. And I was like, do you have a sense for when he might come back? He's like, no, I don't. But Brian Russ said, you know, it did not sound overly serious given that he had been skating, that he was pretty close to playing. So signs point to this not being something that's going to hold the Penguins captain out for too long, but you never really know. I mean, we're not getting a ton of information from across the Atlantic Ocean, and we'll see when he returns what the Pens say and what he says about his status. Obviously, any absence for Sidney Crosby, who leads the team in goals and points, has not missed a game for the Pens this season. It's going to hurt a lot, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. One piece of news from today, from this morning, Monday as we record, is that Avery Hayes was called up from Wilkes-Barre Scranton. Now, you could take this to mean that they anticipate Crosby to be out. Not sure. We'll find out more about the context behind this move at practice today, hopefully. But I would also say he could be getting called up because he has 12 goals in the last 11 games. If you include his 2-goal NHL debut right before the Olympic break in Buffalo. He's had 2 hat tricks in the past 5 games for Wilkes-Barre. The man is on fire, and he deserves another NHL shot. We'll see if how long he's going to be staying in Pittsburgh, but certainly seems like a guy who is ready for more. And we'll hopefully speak to him today to hear about sort of this crazy turn in his career. He's waited a long time, and now all of a sudden it seems like he's got a much bigger opportunity than it seems like he would just a few weeks ago. Now, let's quickly touch on the Olympics outside of Crosby. I know that's what Pens fans were most concerned about, but, you know, it was just an incredible tournament. to have the golden goal ending for the U.S. was pretty special. And yesterday I went to practice right after that game. Saw a bunch of youth players milling around. There was a series of games up at the Pens facility in Cranberry, and spoke to a few 10U players and their parents, and they said they'd watched the game together and described this reaction where they see the golden goal go in and they run into each other's arms, and literally if you see like the screen above them and then where these kids were, they were pretty much doing the same thing, mobbing each other, just like the U.S. Olympic team was doing in Milan. And then one of their team managers, Joe Welch, was kind enough to send me the video of the team celebrating immediately afterwards. You can see that on my Twitter, King_Jemison. And then apparently shortly after we finished recording, the kids were running around the Pens facility chanting USA, USA. So this is a special moment that I think can inspire the next generation of American hockey players. It might not be the miracle on ice. It's certainly not. But 46 years to the day later, this generation got their own moment. And I think Brian Russ spoke well about sort of what this can mean. Dan Muse spoke about what it could mean. Both of those guys obviously having lots of connections to American hockey. And you can see and read those answers at Post-Gazette.com at the most recent story up there. But I think it's just going to be something to monitor moving forward to see how much of an impact this can have. And when you pair that with the women's game, in which you had 4 Pens elite players on the U.S. Women's Olympic team, they beat Canada in overtime as well for the gold medal. You're talking about a movement that I think can have lasting ramifications for both the men's and women's game here in the United States. I think there's certainly some frustrations with the Olympic tournament too. Having the game come down to 3-on-3 overtime, as much excitement as that causes, it certainly does feel slightly gimmicky compared to the game as a whole. But I think, the U.S. might not have deserved to win the game from a level play between the nets situation. They certainly did not control the puck. Canada was absolutely peppering Connor Hellebuck, but they deserve to win because of that netminder. And I spoke to the 10-year-old goalie of the Pens Elite, and his name is Max. And Max was just so excited about Connor Hellebuck and said it inspired him to maybe do that in the Olympics himself one day. So, similar to Marc-Andre Fleury's impact on goalies in the Pittsburgh region, I'm sure goalies across the United States are going to be emulating Connor Hellebuck for many years to come. And just from a Pens perspective, you're going to see a lot of the American heroes playing against Pittsburgh over the coming days. Jack Hughes, with the overtime golden goal, is going to be here with the New Jersey Devils on Thursday, or at least is scheduled to be. The Pens are going to the Rangers, and of course, Mike Sullivan, former Pens coach, current Rangers coach, led the U.S. to that gold medal, and 2 Rangers with Pittsburgh connections, Vinny Trocheck and JT Miller, are, of course, with New York as well. And so that will be another game with lots of Olympic connections and Pittsburgh connections. And then Sunday, just one day later, Jack Eichel, Noah Hannafin, and the Vegas Golden Knights will be in Pittsburgh. So if you were captivated by this U.S. Olympic run, as so many of us around the country were, going to have a chance to see them, many of them playing against Pittsburgh over the coming days and the rest of the season. Some other Pens news and notes before we get out of here for this Monday edition. Artur Shilovs and Ricard Raquel returned from the Olympics, and they were at practice on Sunday. Erik Karlsson was not at practice, but Dan Muse said he expects him to be back Monday. We'll get to hopefully hear more about his experience there, but I think all of them had moments to be very proud of in this tournament. Artur Shilovs got a couple of starts for Latvia, was able to deliver them a win against Germany, a big upset in that game, had 10 saves on Leon Draisaitl. He did not get to start in Latvia's elimination game against Sweden. And Elvis Merzlikins did not have his best day there, so maybe that was a mistake for Team Latvia, but nevertheless, a great experience for a young goaltender to be out there on the world stage. Ricard Raquel had a bottom 6 role. We did see a lot of the things that make him great beyond scoring here in Pittsburgh. The plays along the boards, his willingness to go to the dirty areas, the ability to play both sides of the ice. Even if he ended up with just one assist over the course of the tournament. And then Erik Karlsson played some of the heaviest minutes for Sweden. Ended up playing the most minutes of anybody in their quarterfinal loss to the United States. Had 4 assists, no goals, but was certainly a huge part of everything they did. And impressive to see how big a role he had 12 years after he was named the Olympic tournament's top defenseman in 2014. Now, other Pens notes from last week that we didn't get to because it didn't have a podcast, but of course, again, post-gazette.com to read about all of this. Kris Letang came back on their first day of practice on Tuesday, was immediately participating in everything. He's still technically on IR, but it seems like he will be able to return when they get back to game action on Thursday because he's been out there practice every day. Filip Hallander was also practicing their first day last Tuesday after he's been sidelined since November with a blood clot. He'd been working by himself for a while, but to see him back with the team was really, really cool. And he talked about how grateful he was for hockey after having it almost taken away, and just a really reflective media availability with him there on Tuesday. And then shortly afterwards, he was sent down for a conditioning stint to Wilkes-Barre Scranton. So that will last for 5 games, and then we'll see what happens next for Hallander from that point. He was a really impactful player at the beginning of this season, really, really solid, advanced figures. The Pens were solidly outplaying and outscoring their opponents with Hallander on the ice. He spent some time on the top line with Brian Rust and Sidney Crosby. So we'll see what the role for him is. As we've spoken about many times on this podcast, the Pittsburgh Penguins forward lineup is pretty set. It's hard to break in there. Obviously, Avery Hayes looks like he might be getting another shot. He's at least going to be in Pittsburgh today, and he's been called up. You would think he's not being called up just to practice for a couple days, but we'll see. But maybe Filip Hallander will have a way to slide in later on as well. And as soon as you talk about having some fully healthy lineup, that never happens. Of course, you hope it does, but it's always good to have depth to be able to turn to. Sergei Murashov, I wrote about him last week. I encourage you to go check that piece out because it was really, really cool to get to talk to him, his sister in Russia, one of his best friends in Russia, his goaltending coach in Wilkes-Barre Scranton, and of course, Sergei himself. He's a fascinating guy, has a lot of interests outside of hockey, but I think those interests sort of feed into the player that he is and the fact that he is such a mature and ascending goaltender at age 21. Well, he had another shutout yesterday for the Baby Pens. He's up to a 26-1 record with a 2.13 goals against average and .924 save percentage for Wilkes-Barre Scranton. All of those are among the top marks in the AHL. So we've just seen him have a fantastic season and looks ready for another NHL opportunity. Not sure if that's going to happen this season with Shilovs and Skinner, but it is amazing to have Murashov waiting in the wings if you are the Pens organization. Now, 26 games to go, with the first one being Thursday. They have 3 games in their first 4 days back after the Olympic break, so it's not exactly a friendly start, and that's pretty much what it's going to be like for the rest of the way. The Pens have 22 games in the first 39 days after the break. That includes 17 games in March alone. If you're doing the math there, that is not a lot of off days. And on top of it all, they also have the hardest remaining schedule, according to Tankathon, with an average remaining win percentage of their opponents at .590. 2 games against Colorado Avalanche, 1 against the Lightning, 3 against the Carolina Hurricanes. As I mentioned at the top of the show, those are 3 of the 4 teams with the best Stanley Cup odds at this point. They also have another game against the Stars, another game against the Red Wings, another game against the Sabres. All of those teams have been really, really good as well. So, long story short, any absence for Sidney Crosby is going to really, really hurt. And we'll sort of get a better sense for what the lineup might look like as practice goes on this week. But, if he does miss games for the Pens, it is going to add up and compound very quickly because of how often they are playing and because of how competitive this entire NHL slate is going to be down the stretch with so many teams still in contention. So hopefully the Pens captain really is close to a return, and the Pens can hold on to this playoff position that they put themselves in. It would definitely be a disappointment if they don't make it at this point. They've built themselves a nice buffer. The Metropolitan Division is still not going to present the stiffest of competition, but when you look at those remaining schedules, when you look at the Crosby injury factor that we don't necessarily know too much about, when you look at how often they're going to be playing, a lot can happen in these last few weeks of the season. So, of course, we encourage you to check out this feed and post-gazette.com to follow along for it all. So that's going to do it for the Monday edition of the Post-Gazette Penguins podcast. We'll be back later this week with some updates on sort of how practice is unfolding this week as the Pens prepare. And it may not be another episode until after their first game against the Devils and, of course, Olympic hero Jack Hughes. But please like and subscribe wherever you're watching this, and please subscribe at post-gazette.com to get the best of our work, including some final Olympic thoughts from Noah Hiles and all our Pens coverage. I'm King Jemison. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.